I discovered that my family's wealth, which I'd always admired and trusted, was built on a lie. And once I uncovered the truth, everything I knew about them and my future felt completely different. I grew up in what most people would call a dream. Big house, luxury cars in the driveway, a closet full of clothes I didn't even like half the time, and vacations that felt like they were pulled straight from a travel magazine. My parents, at least in public, were picture perfect, polished, charming, and endlessly generous to friends, neighbors, and even strangers. Everyone admired them. Everyone, that is, except me, until I realized I might not really know them at all. I never questioned the wealth. Honestly, I didn't have to. I was raised to assume it was a combination of hard work, intelligence, and a little luck. My dad ran a business empire that spanned multiple states. My mom had social influence that opened doors for the family at every turn. Growing up, I absorbed all of it like a sponge, thinking someday I'd step into their world seamlessly. But life has this funny way of showing cracks in even the most polished facades. It started with something small, a chance stumble across a filing cabinet in my father's office that I wasn't supposed to see. I was 14, nosy and fascinated by the faint smell of old paper and ink. I told myself I was just curious about how he kept his work organized. But the papers I found didn't smell like routine business. They smelled like secrets. Contracts with unnamed companies, financial statements that didn't add up, references to transactions that seemed more like favors than real profits. At first, I didn't understand. I figured it was probably just complex corporate stuff, the kind kids weren't meant to grasp. I shoved the papers back into the drawer, heart racing, and told myself I'd forget them. But of course, I didn't. High school only made the unease worse. I started noticing the little inconsistencies. A cousin's luxury car paid for by the family when no one mentioned her own earnings, strange offhand remarks from my parents about deals that couldn't be talked about, and neighbors who whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. Everything I'd admired, the wealth, the comfort, the reputation, suddenly felt like it could be a veneer. The first real alarm came during a family dinner, the kind where my father liked to impress friends with stories about investments and smart financial decisions. I remember the night clearly. He was talking about a merger that had set the company apart in the last decade, when I noticed a name in the documents I'd glimpsed months before. One of the companies was shady at best, rumored to be involved in legal trouble, yet he spoke about it as if it were gold. I felt a pit open in my stomach, a mixture of curiosity and dread. It wasn't just a financial issue anymore. It was personal. My identity had been intertwined with this family, this world I thought I understood. But if the foundation itself was a lie, what did that make me? Who was I, really, in this picture-perfect life? I tried to ignore it. I buried myself in school, friends, and the shallow distractions that teens use to avoid the hard truths in front of them. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, and mine were about to. Because the first real clue wasn't in paperwork, whispers, or rumors. It was in my mother's expression. I'd been cleaning out her old study, a room I rarely entered, when I found a photo tucked behind a row of antique books. Not a family photo, the kind she'd proudly display, but one from a construction site, yellowed and frayed at the edges. My father was in it, younger, wearing a hard hat and shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize. There was a ledger tucked under his arm, almost hidden. Something about the way my father smiled in the photo, proud but almost forced, made my skin crawl. And then I saw it. The corner of the ledger had a name scrawled in ink, a name that had no place in the history I'd been taught. It was a name connected to something dark, something that didn't belong in a story about legitimate business. I didn't want to believe it. I shoved the photo back, telling myself I was imagining things. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying that smile, that ledger, that name. Questions swarmed me, relentless. Why had no one ever mentioned this? What had they been hiding? And most importantly, if everything I'd admired about my family was built on a lie, what did that mean for me? I didn't know it yet, but that photo was the first domino. Once it fell, nothing about my life would ever be the same. The next few weeks were strange. I kept seeing my family differently, like someone had quietly removed the filter I'd grown up with. Every casual comment, every perfect story they told about themselves suddenly felt like a carefully rehearsed script. I wanted to confront them, to demand the truth, but there was a part of me that feared what I might find, fearful enough that I started my own little investigation, the kind I imagined in movies, staying up late, digging through documents, cross-checking names, and watching for anything that didn't add up. It began innocently enough. I had always been good with numbers, a little obsessive even. I started by examining some of the family's smaller investments, properties, side companies, charitable donations. On paper, everything looked normal. But the more I looked, the more discrepancies I found. For instance, certain donations my parents boasted about weren't to the charities I thought. They were funneled through shadow organizations, organizations that barely existed outside a P.O. box, and some properties that were supposedly bought through honest deals had ownership histories that were murky. I was starting to feel the first real pang of betrayal. It wasn't just about the money. It was the idea that the people I trusted most had built their entire lives on deception. Every family dinner, every toast, we've worked hard for this. What if it was all a lie? Then there were the whispers. I couldn't ignore them anymore. Neighbors, family friends, even a few distant relatives, all of them seemed to know more than I did. They never spoke directly, just half glances, sudden silences when I entered the room, and an almost imperceptible tension that had been invisible to me as a kid. One evening, my father invited me into his office. It felt casual, the way he leaned back in his leather chair and sipped his whiskey, but I could sense something was off. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," he said. His tone was calm, measured, but beneath it, there was an edge. I decided to push. "About the family business," I said, keeping my voice steady. "About some of the deals I've seen in old documents." He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Curiosity is good," he said, "but some things are complicated. You're too young to understand how the world works." It was the same line I'd heard so many times growing up, except now it felt like a warning. A subtle, almost menacing warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that ledger, the photo, and the strange name I'd seen. I needed to know more. I needed to see the foundation of our wealth for myself, even if it meant digging where I wasn't supposed to. The break came unexpectedly. My mother had left her laptop open while she went to a meeting. Curiosity overpowered hesitation. I opened it, navigating past layers of password protections, something I'd learned to do from years of watching her work. And there it was, an email chain that made my stomach turn. It detailed transactions that weren't legal, hints at bribery, and references to a man I'd never met, but whose name kept coming up in whispers during family gatherings. There were even vague mentions of accidents, people who had disappeared after crossing certain lines. I froze. My family, my perfect, admired family, might have been hiding more than just wealth built on tricks. I realized then that my life as I knew it was collapsing. The safety I felt inside our mansion, the pride I carried, being a part of this family, the assumptions I'd made about our morals. It was all crumbling. Every detail now demanded scrutiny. Every smile, every gesture, every word could be masking deceit. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it wasn't as dark as it seemed. Maybe there was some complicated reasoning I couldn't see. But the deeper I dug, the less I wanted to rationalize. Every clue I uncovered pointed to the same frightening conclusion. My family's empire wasn't just built on a lie. It might have been built on people's misfortune, secrets, and deliberate manipulation. And that's when it hit me. It wasn't enough to just know the truth anymore. I had to understand the full story. I had to see where the cracks in their empire really were. Because if I didn't, I would never feel safe. Never feel like myself, and more terrifyingly, my future might have been planned by a lie I could no longer ignore. So I made a choice. I would go further than I ever had. I would uncover everything, no matter what it took, even if it meant discovering things about my family and about myself that I wasn't ready to face. Because some lies, once uncovered, don't just change the story, they change the storyteller. By the time I reached the summer before college, I had crossed a line I couldn't go back from. I wasn't just snooping or piecing together hints anymore. I was actively digging into my family's empire, mapping it out like a detective. Every lead brought more questions than answers, and every answer made me wonder if I'd ever been living in a real home, or a gilded cage. Or it started with the man from the photo and the ledger, the one I couldn't place. His name was Vincent Harlow, a businessman with a reputation so murky, even online sources painted him as untrustworthy at best. What unsettled me most were the notes I found linking him to my father's earliest acquisitions. Real estate deals that had seemed legitimate were connected to offshore accounts, shell corporations, and legal loopholes that felt like loopholes only a corrupt empire would exploit. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing it became. A company my parents had claimed to have bought honestly had accidental bankruptcies surrounding its previous owners. There were lawsuits quietly settled, competitors disappearing, and hints of intimidation disguised as business strategy. I started to realize something my younger self couldn't comprehend. The world my parents built wasn't just based on luck or hard work. It had been carefully constructed, sometimes at other people's expense. One night, I confronted my father, hoping for some explanation that could make sense of it all. I remember the words clearly. "Dad, who is Vincent Harlow? And what's with all the deals that don't add up?" He looked at me, really looked at me, as if he were weighing whether to tell me the truth or teach me a lesson about obedience. Some things are necessary, he said slowly, his tone calm, but his eyes were sharp. You think the world rewards innocence? Sometimes the rules don't work the way we want them to. You'll understand one day. But I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I wanted honesty. And when he refused, I knew I'd have to find it myself. The next weeks were a blur of late nights, quiet phone calls, and secret meetings. I reached out to people who had once done business with my family, old accountants, and even former employees. Some refused to talk. Some whispered warnings, telling me I didn't know what I was getting into, and some told me pieces of the truth so shocking that it made me sick to my stomach. There were rumors of threats, of accidents conveniently timed to benefit my family. There were stories of competitors forced out by financial ruin, and hints of legal manipulation that skirted laws without breaking them outright, but left victims powerless. It was one thing to discover money built on exaggeration or bad luck. It was another entirely to realize that my family's fortune was tied to fear, leverage, and deception. Every conversation, every document, every lead made me more paranoid. I started seeing shadows in our mansion where there had been none before. The rooms I'd grown up thinking were full of warmth suddenly felt like halls of secrets. Even my mother, whom I had once believed to be an innocent observer, seemed different. Subtle remarks, a glare that lingered too long when I asked questions. Things I had ignored for years now hit me like warnings. One night, I found something I wasn't supposed to. A hidden safe behind an old painting in my father's study. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were files, photographs, and letters. Evidence that some of the darkest stories I'd heard were not rumors. They were facts. There were mentions of bribes, threats, and schemes to remove obstacles. Sometimes people, sometimes entire businesses that had been in the way of the family's growth. There were numbers that didn't belong, wealth that was untraceable, and names that should have never crossed paths with my family's empire. And there, tucked at the bottom of the safe, was a personal letter addressed to me. My father had written it years ago, clearly assuming I'd find it when I was older. He warned me, in cryptic terms, that the family's fortune came with a price, and that some truths were dangerous to know. The final line lingered in my mind long after I closed the safe. Understanding is a gift, but it can also be a curse. Choose wisely. I didn't choose yet. I didn't even know what choosing meant. All I knew was that my life, the life I had planned for myself, was no longer mine to navigate freely. My future, my choices, and even my sense of self had been intertwined with secrets I couldn't unsee. And then it hit me. I wasn't just angry, scared, or confused. I was furious. Furious at the people I had admired, the people I had loved unconditionally, had let me live in ignorance. Furious that the world I thought I was inheriting had been tainted from the beginning. And more than anything, furious that I had no idea how deep this went, or if I could ever untangle it without destroying everything around me. Because the deeper the truth ran, the more I realized one thing. Uncovering it could change everything. My family, my name, my future, they were all tied to a house of cards. And I was standing right in the middle of it, holding the wind. By the time I hit my senior year of high school, my life had split into two halves. The one I showed the world and the one I lived in secret. I smiled at friends, attended parties, and pretended everything was normal. But inside, I was a different person. Every conversation, every interaction with my family was colored by the knowledge I now carried. And the more I learned, the more dangerous it became. The turning point came when I found a file labeled Contingencies. It was thick, yellowed at the edges, and filled with names, dates, and detailed instructions. Whoever wrote it had anticipated that someone might start asking questions. Me, probably. The instructions were chilling: legal maneuvers, threats, and careful steps to control anyone who might dig too deep. Some names were people I'd met, friends of the family, employees I had seen since childhood, and they were marked with little notes like watch, neutralize, and contain risk. I froze. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents hadn't just built wealth. They had built a network designed to protect that wealth at any cost. And I was standing smack in the middle of it. I tried to confront my mother first, hoping for guidance or at least a shred of honesty. I approached her in her study one evening, the same study where I had first found the photo of my father shaking hands with Vincent Harlow. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes narrowing. Then she smiled. Not a warm smile, but a calculated one. "Some truths are too heavy for a child," she said softly, "and some truths are dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" I shot back. "For me? For everyone else?" She didn't answer. She simply walked away, leaving me alone with the question. And I realized then that my parents weren't just hiding things to protect themselves. They were hiding them to protect the empire they had built. And maybe in their minds, that included protecting me. But I didn't feel protected. I felt trapped. I knew I had to decide, ignore it and live my life in ignorance, or dig deeper and risk everything. The choice was mine, but the consequences would not be. So I chose to dig deeper. I started reaching out to people my parents had wronged, quietly, one by one. Former business partners, ex-employees, even distant relatives who had fallen out of favor. Some were cautious, some hostile, but all had pieces of the puzzle. And the picture that emerged was more horrifying than I could have imagined. Financial manipulation, legal intimidation, even coercion. People had been pushed aside, silenced, or made complicit in ways I didn't fully understand. The worst part? I began to see parallels between my parents and me. I had inherited more than their wealth. I had inherited their cunning, their ability to manipulate situations, their sense of control. I didn't want it, but I couldn't deny it. One night, after a particularly long session of digging through files in my father's private library, I realized I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching me. At first, I thought it was a family employee, but the subtle movements, the way a shadow lingered near the staircase, it was calculated, precise, and unsettling. I had crossed a line. I wasn't just investigating anymore. I was a threat. I knew then that the truth had a cost, and that cost could be my safety, my family relationships, or even my life. It forced me to make a choice I wasn't ready for, expose the lies and risk destroying everything I had ever known, or bury the truth and live with the knowledge that my entire life had been a carefully constructed illusion. I couldn't bury it. And so I made my plan. Not a reckless, naive plan, but a calculated one. I would gather every piece of evidence, document every deception, and prepare for the moment I could confront my parents with the full truth. And if they refused to change, I would have no choice but to reveal it to the world. It was terrifying. Yes, but the anger inside me, anger at being lied to, anger at the injustice, anger at the betrayal was stronger. I was no longer a child. I was no longer the naive observer of my family's empire. I was an active player, and I intended to take control of the narrative. The walls of my childhood mansion felt different now. I saw them not as a sanctuary, but as a gilded cage, filled with secrets, lies, and power struggles I had never agreed to participate in. But I had chosen to step into the cage anyway. Because sometimes uncovering the truth means risking everything, and I was ready to risk mine. The day I decided to confront my parents, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. The weight of years of deception pressed down on me, but beneath it was a fire I couldn't ignore. I wasn't just confronting lies anymore. I was confronting the people I had loved and trusted my whole life. I started with my father. I asked him to meet me in his study, the same room where I had first found the hidden safe, the same room where shadows seemed to linger in every corner. He was calm, almost unnervingly so, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "Sit down," he said. "I suppose it's time." I took a deep breath and laid it all out. Every document, every email, every story I had verified from outside sources. I didn't accuse. I presented facts. I wanted him to see the full weight of what I had uncovered. At first, he didn't react. He just listened, his expression unreadable. But when I reached the most damning evidence, the files linking him directly to bribery, manipulation, and silencing of competitors, his posture changed. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You don't understand," he said quietly, almost pleading. "This was never about hurting anyone. We built this to survive, to protect the family. Everything we did was necessary." I shook my head. "Necessary? You call ruining people's lives, hiding your crimes, and lying to me necessary? I admired you. I trusted you. And it was all a lie." My mother entered then, her face calm but eyes sharp, like a blade eyes hidden behind silk. "You think you understand," she said, "but understanding has a cost." "Yes," I said, "and I've already paid it by learning the truth. But the cost for you, should it continue, will be much higher." I presented the evidence I had collected from outsiders, showing that their network of influence and intimidation could no longer protect them. I wasn't just a child anymore. I had learned to navigate the world they had taught me to manipulate, and now I could use that knowledge against them. It was a tense, hours-long confrontation, with every secret laid bare. I saw them not as parents, not as mentors, but as flawed humans who had chosen power over integrity. And I realized something even deeper. I had a choice. I could forgive, move forward, or dismantle everything they had built. I didn't forgive them. Not yet. Instead, I made it clear that their empire could no longer be a shadow over my life. I informed legal authorities, ensuring that investigations would uncover the full truth. I spoke with journalists and insiders, carefully revealing what was necessary to hold them accountable while protecting myself. I was meticulous, just like they had taught me, but this time I used the skills for justice, not control. The aftermath was chaotic. The public exposure of my family's actions made headlines. Businesses they had controlled were investigated. Allies turned away. And through it all, I watched my parents struggle not with public scrutiny, but with the knowledge that their secrets, their power, and their control had been stripped away. It wasn't easy. I lost relationships I had once thought unbreakable. Some friends from their social circle abandoned me. And for a while, I felt the emptiness of dismantling the only world I had ever known. But with that loss came clarity. I began to rebuild. On my terms. I pursued education and opportunities away from their shadow. I cultivated relationships based on honesty, not appearances. And slowly, I began to understand the greatest truth I had learned from all this. Wealth and power are meaningless without integrity, trust, and authenticity. The mansion, the cars, the vacations. They were all just props. What mattered was who I became after seeing the truth. I had inherited more than money or status. I had inherited awareness, resilience, and the ability to carve my own path, free from the lies that had defined my childhood. Looking back, I realized that discovering the truth about my family's wealth didn't just change my understanding of them, it changed me. It forced me to confront uncomfortable realities, make impossible choices, and ultimately take control of my own destiny. I may have lost the perfect life I once thought I wanted, but in losing it, I found something far more valuable: myself.